Okay, wonderful. Like David said, CBR will be in the Edinburgh Suite, so if you want to go and chat to them more, please go and find them and ask them as many questions as you'd like. So next up, we have a very special guest keynote. It's from Simon Dixon, and he is CEO, co-founder of Bank to the Future, Bitcoin OG, author, early investor in over 100 Bitcoin companies, and this is his first talk actually in 2 years. So we're very honored to have him, and please welcome Simon to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, check, check. Check, check. Is this one working? Check, check. Check, check. Okay. Okay, this is actually my first talk in about 3 years since COVID broke out. I've been kind of locked up because I didn't want to get a vaccine. And now I've been able to travel. Thank you. So I used to give about 30 presentations all around the year. How do I change slides? Should I just let you know when I want to change? Is there a slide changer or? Okay. Who's on slide changing? I've got a lot of pictures up here. Okay, cool. All right. So if you don't know me, I wrote the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference, and I've invested in over 100 different companies that made the Bitcoin industry, whether that be Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, Bitfinex. This is when they really couldn't get funding because it was such a strange area. And today I'm making sure I don't over-talk because I tend to talk and I've got a lot I'd love to say. But today I'd like to present on Bitcoin cycles and regulatory cycles. But rather than going through it from the perspective of the 4-year cycle that we understand, I'd like to share with you hands-on experience and hands-on stories having gone through all of those cycles, all of the regulatory crackdowns, so I can share with you where I think this goes next. So my story actually began, and it's the reason I'm in the UK is because June the 12th is a very important day for me, and I'll share with you why that is. My journey in Bitcoin really, though Bitcoin launched in 2008, it started for me in 2000. This is when my father, who was born in the Great Depression of the 1930s and went from complete poverty to self-made millionaire, lost his entire retirement in the stock market. Okay, this allows me to walk a bit more. Great, okay. He lost his entire savings and retirement in the stock market, and he asked me, son, can you let me know where my money actually went? Because he had no freaking idea where his money had gone to. Can we go to the next slide? And I vowed to him that I would do that. And so I obsessed over the subject of money for the last almost 2.5 decades now. I went to study, I did mastered in economics. I worked in investment banking. I started as a stockbroker, then worked in market making on the trading floor, then worked in corporate finance. Is there actually a slide changer? It'd be a lot easier if I can control it, but if not, we'll do it this way. You're going to have a lot of, yeah, cool. If you could put all of the copy on this part. Okay. Really, it was in 2006 that I went down the rabbit hole of understanding a bunch of conspiracy theories about how money is created that seemed too untrue to be true, but turned out to be true. And so at that moment, I decided to quit my job in investment banking in 2006 and dedicate my life to joining a community called the Monetary Reform Community. If we could go to the next slide. So this is me as a young, better-looking person. In 2007, this is me outside Westminster with my wife, Bliss Dixon, trying to get the UK government to understand how money is created. And this is prior to the financial crisis. For those of you that know Bank on Dave Fishwick and myself went and spoke on Parliament. And I was trying to let them know 3 things. When you deposit your money at a bank, the bank becomes the legal owner of your money. Once they become the legal owner of your money, they spend it as they choose based upon where they think is a good risk to put that money. And finally, they create digital currency every time they issue a loan. Now, this is 2007, and there was no Bitcoin at this time. And so we decided to take all of our lifetime savings, and we tried to demonstrate when we got really pissed off, we're trying to explain to politicians how money worked, and the financial crisis came along. Northern Rock blew up, if we could go to the next slide. And suddenly everyone was talking about banking. I went from being a very niche topic to hundreds of people coming and seeing some of my presentations. Next slide, if we could. This brings us to what I call cycle one. And so I spent all of my lifetime savings and went deep in debt. I got approximately 150K in debt at the time, spent through all of our banking. We quit our job because we tried to actually create a non-fractional reserve bank. And we went to the Bank of England, and we went to the regulator at the time that was called the FSA, it's now called the FCA, and said, we want to create a bank where people own their money, people can actually dictate where it is spent rather than us spending it for them, and we don't want to engage in fractional reserve banking. And the regulator said to us, it's impossible. They said you have to put 60 million in deposit at a bank that then can leverage it up at the Bank of England with a clearing bank, and then you have to hire the CEO of a bank that's already been regulated, and you have to actually allow them to engage in fractional reserve banking. And so we took a mission to try and open up the Bank of England, and we created something called the UK Crowdfunding Association and UK Digital Currency Association. I was a founding director there. We were trying to get the rules changed so that it was possible to build on top of the Bank of England via API banking. That later led to some reforms like the Challenger Bank reforms and various other things. But we were broke, and we could see there was no feasible business model, and the regulators, they weren't interested. If any of you are familiar with Caitlin Long, she's currently in a battle with the Federal Reserve and many different state regulators because she wants to create a non-fractional reserve bank in the US. And it was actually the solution to the US banking crisis, and yet they still think it's too risky. Why? Because all of the people that have leveraging up their fractional reserve banks in times of distress, they'll deposit with the safest bank, which is full reserve. And that creates systemic risk in the entire banking system and can take it all down. So they want risk in the system because it protects the incumbents. So this brought me to cycle one. And cycle one was my wife, Bliss Dixon, she said, we took our last bit of credit card debt and we flew over to Prague. And I was writing a book. It was called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. And when that book was released, I wanted to understand a bit more. A guy messaged me on Facebook from the UK called Johnny Bitcoin. And Johnny Bitcoin said, I've moved into a squat on Old Street with a bunch of developers that are building this thing called Bitcoin, and I think it's the future. In fact, he sold his house in order to take all of his money and put it in Bitcoin. And so I was intrigued, and I went to the first Bitcoin conference, and there was about 50 people in a room. They were all a bunch of hackers, and I was the banker that kind of came in the room trying to share it. I've still got all of these presentations on my YouTube channel for the whole archive because I documented the whole journey. If we could go a bit further through now. And this is when I first purchased my first Bitcoin. So we bought it at $3. At $3, so imagine this time, I'm completely deep in debt. We literally could not afford the flight, got the EasyJet flight, and tried to find the cheapest hotel possible that we could find. But I found this community. The monetary reform community were just bored shitless because nothing was happening and nothing was going anywhere. And I gave my usual presentation. Hey, when you deposit your money at a bank, the bank becomes a legal owner. You can spend it as you choose. And they shared with me, well, with Bitcoin, you can actually do self-custody. I was like, okay, well, that's what we tried to do. And you can actually spend it peer-to-peer. And you don't need to create digital currency. The money supply and the monetary policy is completely known, completely fixed at 21 million. In that moment, we decided that we'd buy Bitcoin. Bitcoin worked out well for us. We started reinvesting it in startups. One of them was a company called BitPay. Another one was a company called Kraken. Another was a company called Coinbase. Another was a company called Bitfinex. Another called Bitstamp. And another one called Ripple Labs that was trying to do stuff in the banking system, and just kept reinvesting at the same time and following some of the rules that I'll share with you. At that time, that little documentary called 97% Owned, it's still on Netflix today, suddenly got 4 million views. It went from 2 million to 4 million because of the financial crisis. And suddenly, because of Bitcoin, people were now interested in the topic of sustainable banking. In 2010, we realized we weren't going to be able to create a bank, so we pivoted and we created a securities business, which was Bank to the Future. There's me presenting at the first Bitcoin conference. If you could go back to I think it's going through all of them. Okay, 2010, if we go to the next slide. And here's me presenting at Occupy London, and that's the first Bitcoin conference right there. If you go to the next slide. In 2012, I told this gentleman, who was the mayor of London at the time, there's a bunch of companies that would love to come over to the UK because they need a home, because they're not being very welcomed in their own country. And I shared with Boris Johnson a Bitcoin strategy, asked him to make Bitcoin legal tender, asked him to invest in, allow startups to get access to banking. And you can imagine what he said, piss off. And so the mayor of London later became the prime minister and then disgracefully didn't become the prime minister. Next one. So this was 2013. Now, here's the issue that we experienced at the moment. We wanted to allow everyone to invest in Coinbase, Kraken, and all these companies. And so we had to change securities laws in the UK. So we worked with the FCA and we tried to secure a license. And after 3 years, if you could go to the next slide, we entered cycle 2. And in cycle 2, you got your 1.6 million% returns. Nobody did it. No one started right at the first trade and then got through to the $13 trade. But I did the $3 to $13 and managed to hold it. We started to enter into the law enforcement crackdown. Sound familiar today? If you are very nervous today, we have experienced all this before. So in the law enforcement, if we could go to the next stage, this is what I call cycle 2. So cycle 1 was all about proving that this person or this group of people that were coding up in Old Street in the early days, whether they could successfully transition from Satoshi Nakamoto mining 1 million Bitcoins on his laptop and sending them to Hal Finney to figure out whether they could actually make it decentralized. And so we went through that cycle. People started mining on graphics cards. It got more and more distributed. The project got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm telling you, we were having a whale of a time, but we never believed we were ever going to succeed to where we were today. It was just like the monetary reform community, this thing that's just too big to ever happen. And Bitcoin never should have succeeded, but for some reason it did, and I'll share why. So this was cycle 2. Cycle 2 is where we had this big law enforcement crackdown. So Bank to the Future, what we decided to do was actually lean into securities laws. We couldn't get a banking license, it wasn't possible. And so we went to the FCA and said, can you give us a securities license and allow people to invest in all these Bitcoin companies? After 3 years, go to the next slide, we managed to get that through. But there was a catch. They said you can only work with UK businesses and UK investors, and there were none. Nobody wanted to invest. There were no companies in the UK. There was just about one, blockchain.com, that we invested in. But we got that. So we then decided to move on. So in 2014, I went over to my now home. And my now home is the Isle of Man. This is when Max Kaiser started covering it. This is me getting crucified on CNBC because Bitcoin crashed below $300 and I was telling people it's worth investing. And there's a TEDx presentation. So if we could go back to that, next one. So we went to the Isle of Man and we said, I've got this idea. why don't we make Bitcoin legal tender? Stablecoins had just launched. There was this little project that was created by a guy called Brock Pierce, called True Token or Trust. I can't remember what it was. And we said we could create a digital GBP and we could make Bitcoin legal tender. The Isle of Man government loved it. They went absolutely berserk. All of the startups came along to a conference called Crypto Valley Conference. It was about to be made legal tender. They wanted to accept tax with it. Everything was happening. And then the government got a call from the Bank of England. And the Bank of England said, you're a crown dependency. You are the longest standing independent parliament, but we will remove clearing, Operation Choke Point 1.0. We will remove clearing to your island if you support the Bitcoin sector. The government couldn't pull it off because they got choked by the Bank of England and the whole project failed. So then we moved on, 2015. We moved to the next cycle. Bitcoin started reaching more and more highs. More and more people were interested. We had to leave the country. UK, we just couldn't do it. The pressure was getting too hard. Moved to Hong Kong, had to leave my home. The book that I wrote got translated into Chinese in Mandarin. Did a whole tour with Jim Rogers across 18 different provinces. And Bitcoin went absolutely berserk in China. Next slide, please. In 2016, what we decided to do with a new home of innovation, we started creating securities. So here is a volcano-powered mining rig that we created in Iceland that we plugged into a security and created the first Bitcoin bond that paid dividends in Bitcoin every day. We paid thousands of Bitcoins to all of our investors. They were receiving Bitcoin every single day. It was geothermal powered, and this was the first Bitcoin volcano bond that happened in Iceland. Then this little project came along that was really started mainly in between UK and Canada because this journalist called Vitalik Buterin was pitching his little startup called Ethereum. And later I invested in the ICO and we created this Ether mining-backed security where people receive tens of thousands of Ether, all below $1. They're receiving them as dividends every day, all because we were doing it in compliance with securities laws, and it allowed us to persist. If we go to the next slide. In 2016, we had our basically in this cycle, we had our two hacks. Mt. Gox was a disaster. 70% of all the Bitcoin that was traded was on Mt. Gox, and they lost everything. We thought our industry was over, and in 2016, Bitfinex also got hacked. We actually decided to solve it rather than go into a Chapter 11 like Voyager, Celsius, and all the others. We sold it with free markets. We actually created a security token. This was the first ever security token that allowed people that had lost their money to actually have a token, and they could redeem it for debt when the company came back in the future, or convert it to equity and shares in the company. They actually ended up completely recovering. They filled the entire hole, and the whole $72 million or 119,000 Bitcoin was filled at that time. And we did it all with free markets. The whole thing was done and complete within 6 months or so. So that we did the equity part of that with Bitfinex. If you carry to the next slide. And then we entered into cycle 3. So we managed to get through that. And law enforcement started to go nuts. We had Japan that went nuts with Mt. Gox. We had FinCEN that said everybody needs to be a registered money transmitter. Now SEC is saying everybody needs to be a securities business. At the time, they said money transmitter. The UK started to get rid of all of its crypto businesses and stuff. Okay, cycle 3. This is what I call surviving token printing. So in the surviving token printing phase, by the way, how are we doing for time? How much have I taken? Does anybody know? Okay, I'll keep going until you chuck me off the stage. How about that? The security token printing phase. This was a really scary phase. So Bitcoin reached it, got through the hacks, it got through the law crackdown, it became decentralized, and suddenly people started forking Bitcoin and saying there's now 42 million Bitcoin. Bitcoin Cash came along and the whole community went berserk. We all started fighting with each other. The regulators, the law enforcers tried to take over the code. The coders tried to take over the code. The companies tried to take over the code. The VCs tried to take over the code. And the whole thing was tried to be taken over. But we ended up surviving that. And it turns out that the properties of Bitcoin are impossible to replicate. We had the ICO boom and bust. We didn't sell them as securities. That created our, crazy. We had a few companies that came through that. But each cycle, it survives and reached new all-time highs. So we went through the, I think, 2,300% or 2,700% returns here. At this stage, I'm completely blessed because I set some rules that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. And if you walk away with one thing, please take these 5 rules. They changed my life. I believe they can change others. And as Guy would always say, not financial advice. Next slide, please. So we hit cycle 3. What happened next? So here's our portfolio now. We got all of investors into all of these companies. They're becoming multi-billion-dollar unicorns. Our industry is growing and growing. Bitcoin starts getting institutional adoption, but we still didn't have a sovereign or a country that would back us. Next slide, please. We ended up actually selling our, so we had a registered securities business. We ended up selling it to Coinbase. So what's interesting today in this regulatory crackdown is we know for a fact that Coinbase has a registered securities business that they can use because they bought it from us. And so we created a security token market, and this is probably where the future of the industry is going. Next slide. We then hit, in 2020, I decided to, I released a free video series on this website where I wanted to show people started coming to me and saying, Simon, it's all right for you to talk about Bitcoin, you were there early. And I said, no, I'm gonna start again today, and I'm gonna show you exactly what I would do if I were starting again today. So I did that in 2020. If we could go to the next slide. I invested $1 million live, showing what I would do, saying that you don't have to be there, and it scaled back if you're starting from $10 as well. So then we hit cycle 4, and cycle 4 is where we are today. And cycle 4, our challenge is we have never had Bitcoin in an inflationary environment where the government is not printing money and trying to suppress money printing. So the cycle 4 was all about surviving what I call quantitative tightening. But it turns out the banking system can't continue with quantitative tightening because it self-implodes. So in cycle 4, this is where we are right now. My non-financial advice is that I believe that the Bitcoin cycle will persist and continue. This is our first test of this. So what happened in cycle 4? And some of you will be experiencing this in real time right now. Well, the first thing, that, if you go to the next slide, this was, I managed to actually go and speak to President Bukele and go to El Salvador and shared the Bitcoin bond strategy. And this time, President Bukele decided to make Bitcoin legal tender. UK failed, Isle of Man failed, El Salvador did it. And when I went to El Salvador, I started going around people on the street that for the first time were learning, and I decided that if anyone would accept my Bitcoin, and by the way, in the early conferences, I'd go to a conference like this, and I'd give anyone that would download a wallet free Bitcoin at the time. In El Salvador, I was giving away Bitcoin to anybody that would agree, and I would sit down with them and share some of the rules that I'd like to share when I close this presentation. So we had got that in 2021. We got our sovereign, so we now got our corporate. We got a retail adoption, corporate adoption, and our first signs of sovereign adoption. Next slide. But then we had COVID, and that is the last presentation I gave. So I was presenting, if you go back in 2020 in Miami, on how DeFi had just passed $250 million locked up in contracts. That's where I started the whole COVID thing. And they decided that they're going to shut down the entire economy and quadruple the money supply at a rate that we have never seen before. Obviously, that led to inflation, and then that led to all the consequences that we got. It then turned out that we completely had an incredible amount of leverage and scams in our industry. One of the investments that I made, which was the worst investment I ever made, was in 2020 when I went to that Miami conference. I invested in a guy that lied to my face called Alex Majinski at Celsius. And I decided to put 1,000 Bitcoin on Celsius and we raised $20 million for the company. Now, to me, I'm sorry, I know that it's insensitive to say, but I was risk managing. I was trying a strategy, which I'll share with you in the 5 rules, of borrowing against your Bitcoin because I didn't want to sell it. And so I put 1,000 Bitcoin in, and it was meant to generate enough yield to pay the interest, and then I was buying gold as a hedge. Turned out that it was a complete and utter fraud. They were using our funds to pump and dump a token, created a $3 billion hole and lied to everybody's face. And I just spent the last year of my life trying to fix that problem, just like we tried to in the Bitfinex one, to support the victims. And it really took me full circle. The reason is, so let's go through it. So we had the crypto deleveraging, and it turned out the emperor had no clothes. And then we had the banking crisis that follows, going full circle. Next slide, please. Okay, so this brings us to June the 12th, and then I'd like to end with 5 rules that I'd love everyone to walk away with if you think you can do that. June the 12th is the day that Celsius decided to suspend withdrawals, and that is the 1-year anniversary next Monday. Over the last year, I've done a Twitter space every single week with victims, the 650,000 victims that fell into that. We lost lives, we've had suicides, we've had people that were putting their entire life savings and retirement funds into that company because he targeted elderly people, asked them to convert to stable coins, put them in Celsius, even though he knew there was a multi-billion-dollar hole. And so for the last year, it has been a complete obsession for me, working to see if we can turn that mess. And it turns out that with that funds, they took our money, took a massive loan, and invested in probably one of the biggest Bitcoin mining operations. And approximately all of the tokens have gone across to the Ethereum staking right now. There's a $3 billion hole that we have to try and make up, but we started creating a reorganization plan. The reason this meant so much to me was because of my backstory. On the very day that Celsius suspended all those retirement funds, my father passed away on the same day. And I had to come out in order to try and put together a plan. And this is Reg Dixon. He was born in 33 and sadly passed away 22. And the reason I'm here is to go play my respects for him on Monday, which is the 1-year anniversary when Celsius closed the funds, locked out all the retirement funds of many people. And it's really been a mission ever since. Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide. Look, I'm completely over time. If you want me to end here, I'll end here. But I did want to share 5 investing rules, and I'm probably the only thing between you and your lunch right now. Would you like me to share them? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to go through 5. I'm writing my next book. I stopped writing it because I wanted to have everything that's happened during cycle 5. In cycle 5, which is where we are next, I think we have to survive central bank digital currencies. It's a big thing, big topic. And finally, I think the next cycle, cycle 6, is surviving AI. And those 6 cycles, I believe, will turn Bitcoin into a very boring asset class like gold that preserves your wealth. But now there is still the opportunity that I saw a long time ago and has served me so well. Okay, so let's go to the 5 investing rules I'd like to end with. I set a rule for myself in 2011 after going to the first Bitcoin conference and purchasing at $3. I said to myself, I want more Bitcoin every month, no matter how small it is. And so I took a percentage of my income and I figured out different investing things that I would do along the way. But my rule was I will never take more risk to ensure that I have more Bitcoin every month. The only time I violated that was when Celsius took 1,000 Bitcoin. And so I was pissed. So first rule, no matter what you do, I believe that Bitcoin is our best shot at ever achieving digital hard sound money. It's money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply. And I believe everybody should have more of it every month, not financial advice. It served me incredibly well and gave me life, gave me wealth I could never imagine was possible. And now I get to be in a level of financial freedom from deep in debt that I just never imagined was possible. Rule 2. Value your wealth in Bitcoin. Don't value your wealth in pounds. Don't value your wealth in euros. Don't value your wealth in dollars. Value your wealth in Bitcoin. Your wealth is how many Bitcoin you have. It changes the way you think, because my job is to get more Bitcoin, not to get more dollars. When you think in dollars, you end up trading, you end up FOMO, you end up doing all the things that made people. I was involved in the entire cycle of the highest performing asset class in history, and I know people that are broke that were at that same conference because they didn't implement these simple rules. So value your wealth in Bitcoin, end up with more Bitcoin every month. Rule number 3. Spend fiat currency. How many people sold their Bitcoin because they were combining spending money with savings? The fiat currency system took out savings where everybody had to speculate on real estate and stock markets. You used to be able to save before these excessive fractional reserve Ponzi schemes. You used to have money backed by gold and you could save it and it would be a store of value. You can no longer have that. So they took savings out of it. How many people spend their Bitcoin because they combine it with their savings? So I separate. I make sure that I'm earning enough fiat currency so that I can convert some of it into savings, and savings is hard money. And then when you do that, you can take a percentage of it and you can get a bit more speculative if you choose. And that's why I invested in Ethereum ICO and various other things. But once you get that right, that your fiat currency is your spending, your Bitcoin is your saving, you end up with more Bitcoin every month and you value your wealth in Bitcoin, you get to the point where you can invest in all the interesting opportunities. And most people do this backwards. They try to trade their way into it and then convert it to Bitcoin if they hit the jackpot. That it may work for 5% of you, for 95% it will get you wrecked. And then you have enough money that generates enough income so that you can do the things. So when Celsius blew up, I was able to spend a year of my life, and I'll spend the next year working on that, because that's the contribution I wanted to give and the thing that made me excited to do. Okay, so rule number 3 there. Got our final 2 rules. What have we got? I invest in being wrong all the time. I thought that the Ethereum ICO was crazy because there was no fixed money supply. It wasn't like Bitcoin, but I invested even though I was wrong, and I still got those tokens because I followed those simple rules. And the way that I do this is I say, put your portfolio into 3 sections when you start getting this. The first is, you will go broke trying to bet against the Federal Reserve. I thought this is a Ponzi scheme for the last 25 years since I discovered how money works. And in that 25 years, they rolled over, and people go broke betting against the Federal Reserve. I decide to take some of my Bitcoin out and invest it in the US empire, rolling over to a central bank digital currency and becoming a communist socialist country, because that's the inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed result of fractional reserve banking. The second is, at one stage, that currency will hyperinflate, and I believe in our lifetime we will have a change in empire. And so I have a change in empire portfolio. But then I have the no empire portfolio, which is the Bitcoin rules that I say. all the returns were made in the Bitcoin side, but I want to be in a position where no matter what happens to Bitcoin, no matter what happens to anything else, my financial position never puts me where my father went and where we went when we were dead broke trying to figure this one out. And so 3 portfolios is how you protect yourself. I know it's a lot of information, but the final rule, have a 10-year plan rather than a 1-year plan. Most people vastly underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years. And so they over-speculate because they're trying to become wealthy in 1 year. I never imagined what the last 10 years could do for me. And here's the funny thing, when you do the maths, you realize you do not need the excessive risk that everybody's taking. Just doing those simple things with Bitcoin, just doing a bit of proof of stake to try and end up with something else, just doing those simple things, when you do the maths and compound them, actually is every single person, if you have 10 years left, and if Bitcoin succeeds, it's life-changing amounts of money and you don't need to do all the speculation. And so many people didn't get wealthy along that cycle because they overtraded, they spent it, they violated those rules, they didn't protect themselves along the way, they got overconvicted into one outcome. And if you can get good at this, I genuinely believe that you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked really badly from fiat system and all sorts of stuff. Others are going to do really well, and I want as many people on the right side of that change as possible. So that's rule number 5, and that's all I've got. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, that's where I give most of my content. And sorry I spoke over. It's been a long time in the making. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.